The O'Reilly Factor's on tonight. A shocking display. Michael Brown's stepfather screaming for violence after the decision last night. Tonight, we'll analyze all that has happened thus far.
This was a foregone conclusion. This was a rigged game.
An outrageous statement impugning the honesty of 12 grand jury members. Is it legal? We'll take a look at the facts.
I know of people in my own party, in my own government structure, who disregard things that we say and how we feel, and we are not going to allow it anymore.
What does that mean? Is that a threat? As emotions run high in Ferguson, Missouri, we'll discuss the matter with Charles Krauthammer and Bernie Goldberg. Caution, you are about to enter the no-spin zone. Factor begins right now. Hi, I'm Bill O'Reilly. Thanks for watching us tonight. If anything happens in Missouri during this hour, we'll take you there instantly as our correspondents are standing by. Reaction to the Michael Brown grand jury decision, that is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. This is a two-track story, the facts and the emotional aspect of what happened. Let's look at the facts first. Grand jury comprised of 12 American citizens heard 70 hours of testimony from about 60 witnesses. They also examined forensic reports, medical documents, and police radio logs. The conclusion? That police officer Darren Wilson was not guilty of a crime when he shot Michael Brown to death on August 9th. In a moment, is it legal? We'll examine the evidence, but in a nutshell, Mr. Brown, close to 300 pounds, became involved in a physical altercation with the officer and was shot 6 times by Mr. Wilson, who fired 12 shots in all. On the face of it, it seems to be a lot of shots. But again, the grand jury is our system, and these folks decided no crime was committed. After the decision, there was looting and destruction, watched by millions all over the world. More than 80 people arrested, hundreds of thousands in damage. At least 16 people were treated for injuries. My question is, where was the National Guard? Why were they not protecting the businesses in Ferguson? It's a small town. Where was the Guard? And Lieutenant Governor of Missouri wants to know the same thing.
And here's my question that the governor must answer. Is the reason that the National Guard was not in there because the Obama administration and the Holder Justice Department leaned on you to keep them out? I cannot imagine any other reason why the governor who mobilized the National Guard would not have them in there to stop this before it started.
Now, Mr. Kinder's opinion is speculation, but certainly Governor Nixon, who held a press conference today, must explain why the businesses were left unprotected, and explain not only in words, but we must see what his policy was, because by not putting the Guard in Ferguson last night, the looters ran wild. This afternoon, the mayor of Ferguson blamed Nixon for not deploying the Guard, and if that is found to be true, Nixon should resign his office. The lack of proper protection by the National Guard put responders, firefighters, and police officers in physical jeopardy. The property loss was inexcusable if it could have been prevented. Most Americans despise these looters who have dishonored the Brown family. Then again, Michael Brown's own stepfather was captured on tape soon after the decision was announced, doing this. Extremely disturbing. Again, people who loot and burn after an 18-year-old American has been killed dishonor the man's legacy. If you want to protest peacefully, fine. If you sincerely believe there's injustice in our system, let your feelings be known. But these looters could not care less about Michael Brown. They are criminals. That was obvious last night. And then there are the pundits, the usual group of charlatans who will say anything to get a paycheck and attention.
It really does seem like the fix was in. And there's a tradition here. There's a tragic tradition with this prosecutor. He's now 0 for 5 in cases in which he's taken to the grand jury cops who shot unarmed people.
I'll make the statement right now. I'll bet you his 2 assistants did not ask for an indictment. He showed exactly what his predisposition was. This was a foregone conclusion. This was a rigged game.
And by saying the grand jury process was rigged, Mark Garagos is calling the jurors themselves liars and worse. You can say you disagree with the grand jurors, but to call them corrupt is an outrageous smear. The whole case makes America look bad. There's nothing good about it. And last night's exposition in Missouri was flat out disgraceful. Period. And that's a memo. Now for the top story tonight, a look at the evidence the grand jury was presented. Here now, attorneys and Fox News analysts Kimberly Guilfoyle and Lisa Wheel. So, Wheel, what caught your attention?
The inconsistency of what the witnesses said there in the grand jury. Their stories were all over the place. And when the prosecutor came out last night in the conference, he said as much. He said as much when they went on the stand. They would say something completely different from what they had told officers. That is not good if you want to bring an indictment. Couple that with the consistency of the forensics. 3 autopsy reports were done. They were all consistent with a motivation of self-defense. That is, that the officer was not chasing after Brown, as some people had said, but was actually shooting at him in self-defense. Clearly, too, the wound to the hand was when Brown was getting into the car and trying to get the gun away from the officer. The forensics were really, all together against Brown and for self-defense. But the witnesses were all over the place.
What about the 12 shots, Guilfoyle? That's a lot of shots.
I don't think so. Having put homicide cases in front of the grand jury, I don't think 12 shots discharged from a semi-automatic weapon is too much or excessive, as long as the self-defense remains intact. And that's what the question was in front of the grand jurors. Did Mr. Wilson have the ability to protect and defend himself? And if he didn't, at what point did he lose that? In terms of the witnesses, yeah, the prosecutor pointed out that there were witness statements that were inconsistent with what we were hearing prior to the grand jury. That's why this was the right way to go. Grand jury proceedings are secret. You go in, you take an oath to tell the truth. The prosecutors in this case, I think, did a great job because they presented exhaustive evidence. Anybody that had a statement or said they were a percipient eyewitness was allowed to come forward and testify to give the facts. You don't have to do that in front of a grand jury, and they did, because they wanted to make sure that they heard absolutely all the evidence so these grand jurors could make a decision on the 5 charges before them.
To have that much evidence brought in front of a grand jury. I did dozens, if not hundreds, of grand jury, and if I got done in half an hour, it was done in half an hour.
Okay,
to go this long.
If Garagos, who's the guy who's smearing the grand jury trial, he's saying the prosecutor didn't want an indictment and tilted all the presentation in that direction.
Why? No, he didn't tilt it at all. He said, here's all the evidence. I'm giving you all the evidence. You decide.
Can it be shaped, and can it be discredited by the people bringing it in?
That's the point, though. He didn't. Because he gave them everything and the kitchen sink, they then were able to make the decision.
And this is the same evidence and facts and circumstances that the federal case would proceed on, okay? You have to understand something. The actual forensics, the ballistic reports, all of that are consistent with Officer Wilson's story. That is a scientific evidence. This wasn't just the state autopsy that was performed. It was the private autopsy and autopsies by Dr. Michael Bonnet. That is very significant when you look at that. And they went to exhaustive hours going through with the jurors to explain all of this evidence about the trajectory, about gunshot residue, about the transfer of the forensic evidence, and the DNA of Michael Brown on the body and clothes of Officer Wilson.
They were in close quarters.
And more forensics, Wilson's own damages, his own bruises to his face. Those were finally brought out. The grand jurors saw all that. They were in an altercation. They were in a tussle. And what some of the eyewitnesses said is, oh, he was shot in the back of the head, meaning he was running away. No, that's not what the autopsies say. He was shot on the top of the head, which is consistent with their being the same height.
And also the evidence is consistent with coming forward. If you're making a shot like this and you're taking shots to the face here, you can still propel forward. It would not stop you in the tracks, and the medical examiner testified to that, again, consistent with that the young man was charging.
Now, Wilson himself came into the grand jury, and I understand testified for 4 hours. He's also going to be doing some TV interviews, Wilson is. But if I had to interview Wilson, I would say to him, we can understand the intensity of the situation. You got a big guy, and you're in close quarters combat with him. But once he started to leave the car, as a police officer, you had backup coming. Wouldn't it have been wiser not to confront him again?
No, not necessarily, because once he turned around, as the forensics show, then what the law in Missouri is, if you have a reasonable belief
if he was coming back toward the right,
the officer can use lethal force, and that's what the grand jury found.
And at the scene, Bill, there was also blood spatter evidence that's consistent with that forward motion and trajectory by the young man towards the officer that matched the distance in the story that he gave. You have to understand something. It's highly unusual, pretty much never happens that the target of a grand jury, in this case Officer Wilson, would come forward and testify, because you do so at great peril.
Absolutely, that can be used against you at trial.
All right, ladies, thanks very much. We appreciate it. Next on the Rundown, Charles Krauthammer will weigh in on the situation. Later, we will talk with the St. Louis Chief of Police, who is on the front lines this evening. Upcoming.